So for anyone who it might be their first time back. I know I've introduced myself several weeks in a row already, but given the pandemic, I know that there are some of you who may just be coming back to Mass for the first time, and it might be your first time seeing me and my first time seeing you. But just in case that is the case for anyone, my name is Father Tirso. I am the new pastor here at St. Julie Billiart. And today's weather is a very powerful welcome to the parish, because you saw that there were buckets all over the place, and it just made it very clear to me what my first major project has to be here at the parish. And so I'm forewarning you all now, we're going to get it done, because I don't like worshiping in a space where we have to put out buckets all the time whenever it rains like that. And so that's going to be my first big major thing that we have to tackle. But beyond that, for those of you who are on Facebook, and especially connected to the parish's Facebook, you know that Father Ton and I did a project a couple of days, maybe about a week or so ago, and we built a raised garden. And since then, everyone has been asking us, what are we going to plant? What are we planting there? But first, I know this really doesn't have anything to do with the gospel or my homily, but I just kind of want to share how it all happened. So one day, about a week ago or so, it was kind of a long day for me in the office. Went back to the rectory. Father Ton was there in the backyard. And I know he and I had already been talking about doing more gardening in the backyard. It was something that I had always wanted as well. And so we were talking about building a raised garden. And then he mentioned, well, we can go to Home Depot. I'm like, oh, you want to do it now? Like, oh, you want to do it today? It was like about 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the evening. I'm like, oh, all right, fine. Let's go. So we were on our way to Home Depot, and then he mentions, wait, there's old pieces of wood behind the Divine Center. So instead of driving over across that way, we just drive across the parking lot, and then so we pick up the old pieces of wood, and I'm like, oh, I just wasted my gas driving to the back of Divine Center. But long story short, we put it together. We built the garden, and we started planting. Now, getting to the homily now, and the gospel message. Now that you know that we are in the process of having a garden in the backyard of the rectory, for anyone who is a gardener, and for anyone who doesn't even have any experience gardening, what is the one thing? What is the one big thing? Big concern, big nuisance of any garden? Weeds. And you know you have to keep up with it. You know you have to stay one step ahead of those weeds, because once they start growing and once they start popping up, it can be a nuisance and it can wreak havoc. And so every single time you see a weed, what do you got to do? Got to pull it up. And when you start seeing weeds spread out even more, you got to pay attention to it, and you got to act almost right away, because otherwise, if you let it go, if you let them grow, then it'll take over. The weeds will take over. So for any of us who have little to no experience in gardening, we know that weeds are not something that we want in a garden. We know that they can cause damage. We know that they can be a headache. We know that they are a nuisance, and they have to be taken care of right away. So knowing that, when we hear the gospel today, when Jesus uses that parable of the weeds and the wheat, we can kind of be confused. We can be confused a little in terms of why Jesus' parable would have the servants be instructed, don't pull up the weeds. Let them grow together. Because we know that weeds are a nuisance. Weeds can be destructive to crop. Weeds can be destructive to flowers and whatever we planted in that garden. We know that we have to stay one step ahead of them. And so when we hear Jesus' parable telling the servants, don't pull up the weeds, let them grow together, it can be kind of confusing. But what we have to realize is the type of weed that Jesus mentions in his parable looked an awful lot like the wheat, especially when they were first sprouting. And so even to the most skilled eye, it was hard to tell the difference, especially when the plants were still small. The only way that the weed and the wheat can be distinguished is letting it grow, because at the end, that's when you knew which one was a weed, which one was a wheat. But you can't tell while they are growing, and you had to let them grow together in order to be able to distinguish it. And then the skilled eye can distinguish between what was weed and what was wheat. And so that was one thing that we need to realize about the parable today. And the farmer in Jesus' time would know that even though he allowed the weed and the wheat to grow together, the wheat was strong enough to resist the impact and the influence of the weed. And so he had every confidence that the wheat would not be damaged or disturbed. And so again, the only option was to allow both of them to grow together. And then in the end, it would be up to the farmer, it would be up to his servants to be able to distinguish which one was weed and needed to be thrown out, and which one was wheat that could be used for crop and for harvesting. Understanding that aspect of Jesus' parable, we can ask ourselves, what does it mean for us today? It means something very simple but yet powerful. And it's something that we need to admit as human beings. Because what is one of the basic human tendencies when we look at other people, when we look at each other, even in this church space, when we look at people in the world, what is one of the basic human tendencies in terms of our relationships with one another? It is to label people as good or label them as bad. And we can think in very clear, black and white, absolute terms, where a good person is good, no matter what he or she does. And a bad guy is always bad, no matter what he or she might do. We put people in those labels. We put people in those categories. And again, we think of them as in absolute terms, where again, the good guys wear white, and the bad guys wear black. Now, of course, Father Ton and I, every day, we're wearing black, so I don't think we want to be named as the bad guys. But in reality, we know that it is seldom that easy to be able to distinguish a good guy and a bad guy. Because there are good people. There are good people in the world who can and are capable of doing some bad things. We can take any one of us, for example. We know that no matter how good we try to be, any one of us here, myself included, any one of us here can be capable and perhaps may have done some pretty bad things in our lives, and may even do some in the future. But of course, for any one of us, none of us here would ever want to be labeled as a bad guy just for one or two things that we may have done that we are not proud of, either in the past, in the present, or even the future. None of us would want to be labeled as a bad guy just for a few bad things. And likewise, the opposite is also true, because there are people out there who are capable of doing some pretty bad stuff that have resulted in them being labeled as bad guys, but they can actually do some pretty good things. Because even a villain can be a good parent to his or her child. Even the worst of humans can have the capacity to do some nice things for someone else. But yet the tendency has been, human tendency has been, to let the image of that person being a bad guy stick and cloud our judgment on anything about that person. And when that happens, the only thing that we see in that other person is all the bad stuff that they may have done. And again, if we do not want that to happen to us, the message today is to realize that we can't do that to others. Because the point to Jesus' parable is simply to remind us that we cannot actually tell who are the wheat and who are the weed. Because the only one who can tell that is God himself. And that is Jesus' point in the gospel, in that parable. To let that be God's job. Let that be God's role. Because only He can distinguish between the weed and the wheat. And that is one reason why He allows good and bad to grow together. Because again, in the end, it is only God who has that ability to be able to be the judge on who is actually wheat and who is actually weed. And so this becomes a powerful reminder to all of us that basically we're all in the same boat. We are all sinners trying to become saints. None of us can put ourselves in the place of a judge. None of us can put ourselves in that position. None of us have the authority to put us in that position. And when we realize that, what truly happens? We no longer are focused on good guy and bad guy, but we are focused more on the mercy of God and what we are to each other. And that we realize, again, we are all in this together. We are all in the same boat. We are all on the same footing. No matter how good we may have been, we know that we can do some bad stuff. No matter how bad someone might have been, we know that he or she is also capable of doing some good things. All of us are in the same boat. All of us are on the same footing. And none of us is the judge. Because when we take ourselves out of that place of being the judge, what happens is that we gain a certain freedom. A freedom to look at another human being and realize that he or she is capable of good. That he or she is capable of being a good person. And that what happens is that we become free to realize that we are journeying together. That no matter how good we are trying to be, we try to be better. And that when, on our part, we want God to be quick in judging. We want God to be quick in punishing. We want God to think in those absolute terms as well, where people are good or bad, and that's it. Clear, cut, black, white, nothing in between. But God doesn't act that way. But when we let God be God, we also gain the freedom of realizing just how good He is to us, and just how good He is to everyone else. And then we celebrate not only God's goodness, not only God's mercy, but our ability as well to be just like God, who is also where we can learn patience, where we can be lenient to others, where we can be less judgmental because we realize that we're all in the same boat and that we're all in this together. As we celebrate this Eucharist, this is the invitation, and this is the challenge. It's a very difficult one because human tendency, human nature again, is so quick to make judgments. But again, if we allow God to be God, and if we allow ourselves to realize and look at every human being as sinners trying to become saints, then not only do we celebrate the goodness in each of us, but we are grateful that God is that good to each and every human being.